Before we look at a practical example, can you explain what you are actually doing here?
Yes, what I want to do is use one hypothetical relationship dynamic to show how unconscious patterns can play out between two people. This is only one example, but it reveals something important. When people are living unconsciously inside the fear patterns the Enneagram describes, their reactions can become remarkably predictable. Not because human beings are mechanical in their essence, but because fear patterns are. And that is one of the clearest signs that we are dealing with unconsciousness. The pattern repeats again and again. So what I am showing here is not simply a problem between two individuals. I am showing how two dragons can meet in a very recognizable dance. In this case, a type 1 dragon and a type 2 dragon. One tries to restore safety through rigidity, certainty, correction, or moral pressure. The other tries to restore safety through accommodation, softening, overgiving, or making themselves smaller to preserve the bond. And what matters here is that both patterns are mechanical, both are fear-based, both are self-sabotaging, and both, in different ways, sabotage the relationship too. That is why awakening matters, because awakening is what begins to interrupt that predictability. It is what helps us see that we are not condemned to repeating the same collision of dragons.
So what does that look like in a hypothetical relationship between a type 1 dragon and a type 2 dragon?
Let's imagine a very ordinary relational moment. Nothing dramatic has happened. There is no great crisis, just a moment of tension, discomfort, or disappointment. In a hypothetical dynamic between a type 1 dragon and a type 2 dragon, the type 1 pattern may begin to react through rigidity, correction, moral pressure, coldness, or withdrawal. Something feels wrong, off, disappointing, or not as it should be. And because the dragon is not yet recognized, the person does not experience that reaction as a pattern. They experience it as justified, necessary, even virtuous. The type 2 pattern, in turn, feels that tension immediately. It senses the disconnection, the displeasure, the withdrawal of warmth, the strain in the room. And because it also does not yet recognize its own dragon, it begins to move toward accommodation. It begins to soften, to explain, to reassure, to make room to restore harmony. It begins subtly or not so subtly. It makes itself smaller so the bond does not rupture. So on the surface, it may look as though one person is the obvious problem. One is pressuring, the other is softening. One is dominating the field, the other is adapting to it. But in my work, both are dragons, because both reactions are unconscious. The type 1 dragon is trying to restore safety through control, certainty, or moral force. And the type 2 dragon is trying to restore safety through self-abandonment or over-accommodation and a fear-based preservation of connection. One says, adjust around my distress. The other says, I will disappear a little so love can stay. And that is what makes the whole thing so painful, because neither person is truly free in that moment. The first is not resting in presence, the second is not resting in truth. One is controlling from above, the other is accommodating from below. And both are reinforcing the very pattern that keeps them from a real meeting. And that is also why awakening matters. Because awakening is what allows each person to begin seeing. This is my dragon. This is the old move. This is the script I have repeated before, and I do not have to keep obeying it.
So what actually begins to happen between these two patterns once they are triggered?
What begins to happen is that each pattern starts activating and reinforcing the other. The type 1 dragon feels tension, disappointment, disorder, or something it experiences as wrong. So it tightens, it corrects, it withdraws warmth, it creates a field of pressure, dissatisfaction, or moral tension. The type 2 dragon feels that immediately. It feels the strain in the room, the disconnection, the loss of warmth, the danger of displeasing, disturbing, or losing the bond. So it begins to soften, to explain, to reassure, to make room, to adjust itself in order to restore harmony. And that is where the dance begins. Because the more the type 1 dragon tightens, the more the type 2 dragon adapts. And the more the type 2 dragon adapts, the less truth there is in the room. So the one dragon does not meet a clear, equal presence. It meets accommodation. And the type 2 dragon does not find safety at all. It meets increasing pressure to disappear inside the bond. That is how the loop starts feeding itself. The type 1 pattern becomes more rigid, the other becomes less visible, one becomes more certain, the other becomes more self-abandoning, and what may look like a relationship trying to stay together is often actually a loop of mutual unconsciousness.
So why does that loop become so predictable and so hard to interrupt?
Because each pattern is not only reacting to its own fear, it is also feeding the other person's fear. That is why the loop becomes so predictable. The type 1 dragon feels disturbed, disappointed, or unsafe in the face of disorder, tension, or something it experiences as wrong. So it moves toward correction, pressure, coldness, or withdrawal in an attempt to restore order and inner safety. But the effect of that on the type 2 dragon is not peace. It is the felt threat of disconnection. So the type 2 pattern begins to work harder. It softens more, explains more, reassures more, adapts more, gives more. And for a moment, that may seem to calm the situation. But it does not bring truth in the room. It teaches the relationship that one person's tension must be managed by the other person's self-adjustment. So the one dragon never has to meet a fully present equal. And the true dragon never has to face the deeper fear that love might still remain even if they stop over-functioning. That is why the pattern becomes so hard to interrupt, because both dragons are rewarded in the short term. The one dragon feels my distress is being answered. The two dragon feels I have restored the bond. But underneath that temporary relief, the deeper fears remain untouched. And because they remain untouched, the same dance returns. The same trigger, the same interpretation, the same protective move, the same painful result, again and again. That is why unconscious patterns can feel so fated, not because they are true, but because they are rehearsed.
What do you mean by rehearsed? Surely they haven't rehearsed this suffering.
No, of course. Well, at least not consciously. People do not choose this suffering on purpose or sit down and rehearse hurting themselves in this way. What I mean is that the pattern has been repeated unconsciously so many times that it becomes practiced. The nervous system knows it, the body knows it, the emotions know it, the mind knows the story that goes with it. So when a familiar trigger appears, the whole pattern can rise almost automatically. That is what I mean by rehearsed. Not intentionally or consciously rehearsed, but repeated so often that it becomes familiar, convincing, and difficult to interrupt. The person has traveled that road so many times that the reaction comes quickly and feels true. So, no, they have not rehearsed the suffering in awareness, but the dragons have rehearsed their roles through repetition. And that is why the same painful dance can happen again and again without either person realizing how inevitable it has become.
What happens with these patterns if they are never recognized and never interrupted?
They can become tragic because dragons that are never recognized do not simply remain as moods or habits. They gather force. What begins as tension in the room, emotional pressure, correction, appeasement, or self erasure, can, over time, become a whole relational world organized around fear. One person may become increasingly rigid, dominating, controlling, or even punishing. The other may become increasingly small, accommodating, confused, and cut off from their own truth. And if that pattern keeps intensifying, the relationship may no longer be a place of meeting, but a structure of survival. That is where things can become very serious. Coercion, psychological harm, chronic fear, and in some situations, even violence. So I think it is very important not to romanticize unconscious patterns as though they are just symbolic. They are real, they have consequences, and understanding the pattern must never be used to excuse the harm. It is used to see clearly how such tragedy can build so that it can be interrupted sooner.
Can that merry-go-round of repetition stop?
Yes, but not through willpower alone. What finally begins to weaken the merry-go-round of repetition is recognition. The moment something is seen clearly as a pattern and no longer mistaken for self, a space begins to open. That does not mean everything changes at once. It does not mean the dragon vanishes overnight. But it does mean the person is no longer completely asleep inside the script. And that matters enormously. Because once I can see the old move as the old move, once I can recognize the dragon taking the throne, once I can feel the invitation to control, to appease, to disappear, to attack, to obey, fear, something in me is no longer entirely fused with it. And that is where freedom begins. Sometimes the first act of awakening is very small, telling the truth, not apologizing for what is not yours, not shrinking, not controlling, not following the old choreography. But those small moments matter because they interrupt what once felt inevitable. And that is how the merry-go-round begins to slow. Not through force, through seeing, not by becoming someone else, but by no longer agreeing to be lived by what fear has rehearsed.
What does it mean to no longer agreeing to be lived by what fear has rehearsed?
What I mean is this. For a long time, fear has been living life for us. It has been choosing the reaction, the interpretation, the protection, the words, the silence, the control, the accommodation. And because it all happens so quickly, we think, this is just me. This is just how I am. This is just what I do. And because we think it is who we are, we do not want anyone to question it or change it. But awakening begins when something in us starts to see the difference between the fear-driven self we have been living from and the more conscious self that is beginning to awaken. And in that seeing, there comes a moment when we no longer give automatic consent to the unconscious pattern. We may still feel the pull of that familiar pattern, the pull to control, the pull to please, the pull to disappear, the pull to defend. But something deeper says, I recognize what this is. I see where this leads, and I do not want to hand my life over to this repetition again. That is what I mean by no longer agreeing to be lived by what fear has rehearsed. It does not mean the pattern never rises. It means the pattern is no longer the unquestioned authority. It is no longer the one we automatically obey. In my first book, I described this shift as moving from being a musician, playing a rehearsed piece of music, and not even our own, to become the composer of the music. In other words, we stop living by the score written by fear and begin to create a different music, one that reflects our true nature and deeper purpose. And that is a profound shift, because before that, fear was living through us. Now, awareness begins to express itself. Now, presence begins to enter. Now, something that is not built on fear has a chance to choose.
So what does conscious behavior actually look like when this old type 1, type 2 dance begins to arise?
Conscious behavior looks very different from the old choreography. It does not mean that the old pattern never stirs. It means that it is no longer the one running the moment. So if the type 1 pattern begins to feel tension, disappointment, or something it experiences as wrong, consciousness does not move immediately into correction, pressure, coldness, or moral force. Instead, there is space. There is a possibility of staying present, of listening, of speaking clearly without trying to dominate the field. And if the type 2 pattern begins to feel the strain in the room, the loss of warmth, or the fear of disconnection, consciousness does not move immediately into self-erasure, over-explaining, over-giving, or making itself smaller to preserve the bond. Instead, there is truth. There is the possibility of remaining kind without abandoning oneself, of caring without over-caring, of staying connected without disappearing. So conscious behavior to me looks like this: kindness without self-erasure, boundaries without making the other person the enemy, compassion without obeying the fear. It means the one does not have to control in order to feel safe, and the two does not have to disappear in order to feel loved. That is the real shift. Not that the dragons never stir again, but that they are no longer the unquestioned authority. Now there is awareness. Now there is choice. Now there is the possibility of a real meeting. Not one person above and one person below. Not one correcting and one accommodating, but two human beings standing in truth, presence, and relationship. And that is how the old loop begins to end.
Is there anything important you want to mention to the person who finds themselves in the more accommodating role?
Yes, and I think it is important to say this clearly. The more dominant pattern, in this case the type 1 dragon, can absolutely be difficult to live with. It can be controlling, cold, rigid, morally pressuring, and in more extreme forms, deeply destructive. That does need to be seen for what it is. But the more accommodating pattern also needs awakening. Because although it may look gentler on the surface, it can be profoundly self destructive. It makes itself smaller. It abandons its own truth. It overcarries. It keeps adjusting around the other person's fear. And in doing so, it can become trapped in a prison that looks like love, kindness of understanding, but is actually self erasure, which becomes a quiet form of self destruction. And I think that is why this pattern can be more difficult to recognize, because the person often believes if only the other one were warmer, if only they were kinder, if only they were less controlling, then everything would be all right. And yes, a controlling pattern is difficult to live with, but it is also revealing to the accommodating person of something they need to see in themselves. It is revealing the imbalance in their own fear pattern. It is showing them how quickly they disappear, how quickly they begin doing too much, how quickly they abandon their own truth in the hope of preserving connection. So the invitation is not only see the other person's dragon, it is also see your own, because unless the more accommodating pattern wakes up to how it keeps leaving itself behind in order to preserve connection, it may spend its whole life waiting for the other person to change without realizing that its own awakening is also required. One pattern may be more outwardly threatening, the other may be quieter, softer, and more difficult to recognize. But both need to be seen because one damages from the outside and the other damages from within. And both keep the soul inside the same prison until awareness enters.
So how does all of this shape the deeper purpose of your work and course?
It is really at the very heart of why I do this work. Because the deeper purpose of my work and my course is not simply to help people understand these patterns intellectually. It is to help them recognize them while they are happening, to help them see what has been shaping their relationships, their reactions, their suffering, and their sense of self from underneath awareness. In other words, my work is there to make the unseen visible, to give people a language for the dragons they have been living with, the loops they have been trapped inside, and the ways they have mistaken fear for who they are. And that matters because once something is clearly seen, the whole relationship to it can begin to change. The course is not there to help people become someone else. It is there to help them recognize the old choreography, step out of the automatic role, and begin to live from something truer. So whether the pattern looks controlling, accommodating, pressuring, pleasing, withdrawing, or self-erasing, the invitation is the same. See it clearly. Do not mistake it for yourself and begin to choose differently. That is the deeper purpose of my work. Not self-improvement, not performance, but awakening. And from there, a different way of being in relationship becomes possible.
For people who want to explore that journey with you, where can they find you?
You can find me on the Awakening channel on YouTube and on my website, artisanofawakening.com.